In the year 37892, humanity had failed 11 diplomatic missions to the hyper-advanced dragon species. The tension aboard Draunus Prime, the orbital diplomatic station circling the dragon homeworld, was thick enough to cut with a ceremonial claw. Screens across the station displayed survival probability metrics that kept dropping with each passing minute. The ornate, yet terrified officials from 17 human colonies paced nervously, their elaborate uniforms adorned with meaningless medals that did nothing to hide their fear. "Are we seriously putting the fate of humanity in the hands of a teenager?" Marjorie Clipwad whispered, her voice trembling. As Earth's tourism administrator, she'd spent decades convincing dragons that humans were worth keeping around as novelty pets and entertainment. Her expertly applied makeup couldn't hide the sweat beading on her forehead. "The algorithm doesn't lie," muttered Tarlok Jex, head of security, absent-mindedly rubbing the scar tissue where his left ear used to be, before a dragon had singed it off during the 7th failed mission. After 11 catastrophes, conventional diplomacy is statistically futile. The unconventional approach is all we have left. The loading bay doors hissed open. Everyone held their breath. Cassidy Nakamura stepped out. A 17-year-old girl with unruly black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore a faded plaid button-up shirt, worn jeans, and muddy boots that had clearly seen plenty of Nebraska soil. Nothing about her suggested humanity's last hope, and that was precisely the point. "Sweet nebulas. She looks like she just stepped off a farm," Clipwad whispered in horror. Tarlok nodded grimly. "She did. Until yesterday. She was working at her family's reptile sanctuary. Apparently, she's some kind of prodigy with cold-blooded creatures." The delegation of dragons across the loading bay visibly recoiled at the sight of the girl. Their massive scaled bodies, each the size of a small shuttle, shifted uncomfortably. Their ambassadorial armor, forged from meteorites and ancestral bones, clinked softly as they conferred among themselves, glancing occasionally at the human child with gleaming, suspicious eyes. Cassidy walked forward with casual confidence that bordered on recklessness. The dragon's inner eyelids flickered rapidly, a sign of agitation or possibly confusion. They had expected armored diplomats, neural-linked translators, or at minimum, adults with weapons. Not a teenager who looked like she'd wandered in by accident. "What is this insult?" hissed Lord Krax, the dragon emissary, his voice rumbling through the station's translation systems. "You send a hatchling to negotiate the fate of your species." Before any official could intervene, Cassidy tapped her communications badge, bypassing the diplomatic filters to broadcast directly on all channels. "Don't be scared, big lizard," she said with a disarming smile. "I just want to hug you." The station erupted into chaos. Officials lunged for emergency protocols. Security personnel reached for weapons. Computers blared warnings about diplomatic breach and extinction-level event imminent. In the command center, overlooking the scene, Dr. Eliza Matsuo choked on her synthetic coffee. Did she just call the Crown Prince of the 7th Dominion a big lizard? And suggest physical contact? We're all going to die. But the most surprising reaction came from the dragons themselves. Prince Vexilahar, heir to the 7th Dominion and destroyer of 3 solar systems, tilted his massive horned head to one side. For the first time in recorded interspecies history, a dragon looked perplexed. "What is a hug?" he demanded, the translation matrix struggling to convey the alien concept. Cassidy's smile never faltered. "I'd be happy to show you, Your Highness, if you'll permit me." The quantum betting algorithms that ran alongside diplomatic channels went haywire. Probabilities split into impossible fractions. Somewhere in the Orion Arm, a predictive AI committed digital suicide rather than process the scenario unfolding. The diplomatic disaster clock, which had been counting down from 17 minutes, the average time previous envoys had survived, froze at 16 minutes and 42 seconds. Prince Vexalaher made a sound like grinding boulders, which the translation matrix interpreted as, "Approach, tiny mammal. Your audacity amuses me. For now." Tarlok Gex activated his emergency neural uplink. "Someone get that girl a briefing on the 57 ritual ways dragons kill humans. Now." But Cassidy was already walking forward, completely unaware of the panic she'd caused, or the fact that her approach violated at least 19 interspecific protocols. As Prince Vexalaher lowered his massive head, a gesture that had preceded the incineration of previous envoys, Cassidy reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and worn. An old-fashioned printed photograph. "This is Ferdinand," she said, holding up the picture of herself as a younger child, cradling an enormous iguana. "He was my first rescue, mean as sin when we found him. But turns out he just needed someone who understood him." The dragon's nostrils flared, detecting the sense of Nebraska soil, reptile habitats, and the faint, sweet, spicy smell of cinnamon that clung to the girl's clothes, her mother's baking, though no one present knew that. Something in that unique combination seemed to intrigue the massive creature. "You tend to scaled beings on your world?" Prince Vexalaher's voice rumbled less threateningly. "Yes, Your Highness. My family runs the largest cold-blooded creature sanctuary in the Midwest. I've been handling everything from tiny geckos to 16-foot pythons since I could walk." In the command center, frantic whispers flew back and forth. "What is she doing? There's nothing in the briefing materials about reptile sanctuaries. No one told her about the protocol. She was supposed to present the Treaty of Alpheus first. She's improvising. Shut it down." But Dr. Matsuo held up her hand for silence, her eyes fixed on the scene below. "Wait. Look at the dragon's tertiary eye scales. They're relaxing. I've never seen that before." Indeed. The small scales around Prince Vexalaher's central eye had shifted from an aggressive crimson to a more neutral amber. The massive dragon had settled into a less threatening posture, his wings folding back slightly. "Tell me of these pythons," he commanded. And so Cassidy began to talk about what she knew best, the behaviors, needs, and personalities of reptiles. She explained how different species required different approaches, how misunderstood they often were by mammals, how their apparent coldness was actually a complex and efficient emotional system. "People think reptiles don't have feelings," she said, her hands animating her words. "But that's just because they're not looking for the right signs. They express themselves differently. But the feelings are there." As she spoke, Cassidy slowly moved closer to the Dragon Prince, maintaining eye contact, but keeping her posture non-threatening. She was applying the same techniques she'd use with a nervous Komodo dragon, though none of the officials watching realized it. Prince Vexalaher's tail, previously lashing with barely contained aggression, had stilled. "And these techniques you use with Earth-scaled ones, they respond favorably?" "Most do, Your Highness. The key is respect. I never assume I know what they need. I observe. I listen. I learn their language." Cassidy had now reached the base of the dragon's enormous neck, close enough that the heat from his scales warmed her face. "May I?" The dragon inclined his head slightly, a gesture that sent ripples of shock through the watching diplomats. With practiced gentleness, Cassidy reached out and touched a specific scale just beneath the dragon's jaw, the equivalent of a pressure point that, in Earth reptiles, often triggered a relaxation response. The moment stretched into an unbearable tension. For 27 seconds, no one in the station dared breathe. Then Prince Vexalaher did something that defied all xenobiological predictions. He emitted a low, resonant vibration, the draconic equivalent of a purr. The command center exploded into silent panic. Dr. Matsuo's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. That's a contentment vocalization. It's not possible." My scales have never been touched by non-dragon claws, Prince Vexelaher rumbled, his massive eyes half-lidded. It is not unpleasant, Cassidy smiled. On Earth, we call this finding the sweet spot. Every reptile has one, a place that, when touched correctly, makes them feel safe and respected. She continued the gentle pressure, explaining as she did so. I'm showing you that I recognize your physical sovereignty. I'm asking permission with every touch. That's the basis of trust between different species. In the observation deck, the Interstellar Stock Exchange representatives were having collective coronaries as dragon market shares plummeted. The Dragon Pheromone Research Society was frantically recording everything, their sensors overloading with new data. Betting algorithms across 3 galaxies spontaneously self-destructed, unable to process the scenario. When Cassidy finally stepped back, Prince Vexelaher remained in a state of unprecedented calm. Your approach is unconventional, young human. Sometimes conventional doesn't work, Your Highness. Sometimes you need to go back to basics, respect, trust, and honest communication. The Dragon Prince considered this, smoke curling from his nostrils in thoughtful wisps, rather than threatening plumes. Perhaps there is wisdom in your primitive methods. That afternoon, against all statistical probabilities, Cassidy Nakamura and Prince Vexelaher began negotiations that would redefine human-dragon relations for millennia to come. The plaid-shirted teenager from Nebraska discussed interspecies cooperation with the same straightforward approach she'd use to explain proper terrarium conditions. Watching from the command center, Dr. Matsuo shook her head in disbelief. She's breaking every diplomatic rule in the manual, and somehow it's working. Tarlok Gex grunted. Rules are for those who can't adapt. The girl's got instincts we couldn't program in 1,000 years. News of the unprecedented diplomatic breakthrough spread rapidly. The Intergalactic Banking Council, which had been calculating the economic impact of humanity's extinction, hurriedly recalibrated its projections. The coalition of civilized species, which had refused to intervene in what they considered an inevitable genocide, suddenly discovered compelling reasons to extend protection status to humans. Dragon cultural influencers, who had been live-streaming what they expected to be an entertaining execution, found themselves trending with unprecedented engagement metrics as they analyzed the Mammal Whisperer's techniques. Void Vlog Supreme, the most popular dragon influencer with 16 billion followers across 17 dimensions, captured the moment Cassidy explained the concept of environmental enrichment to Prince Vexelaher. His live stream broke all existing records when the Dragon Prince allowed the human to demonstrate a scratching technique along his dorsal ridges. This unlikely pair is rewriting interspecies etiquette, Void Vlog narrated, his secondary voice box vibrating with excitement. The human hatchling seems to possess ancient knowledge lost even to our elders. Scale tag this moment. History is happening. By the end of the standard day, preliminary accords had been drafted. The dragons would recognize humans as a species of interest, rather than potential extinction candidates. In return, humanity would establish cultural exchange programs focusing on reptilian appreciation and care techniques. When the official announcement came, the station's atmosphere transformed from dread to disbelief to cautious celebration. She did it, Marjorie Clipwad whispered, mascara streaking down her cheeks. That farm girl actually did it. In the aftermath, Cassidy declined all offers of political positions, military honors, and lucrative media contracts. When asked what she wanted as reward for saving humanity, her answer was simple. I'd like to go home. The iguana breeding season starts next month, and Dad needs help with the incubators. 2 weeks later, as interstellar treaties were being formalized, Cassidy Nakamura was back in Nebraska, serving milkshakes at her family's roadside ice cream stand, a sideline to their reptile sanctuary. The plaid shirt she'd worn during the negotiations had been enshrined in the Interplanetary Museum of Diplomatic History, labeled simply, the hug shirt. When reporters eventually tracked her down, asking how she'd had the courage to approach the most feared being in 17 galaxies, Cassidy shrugged and said, "Big reptiles are just like small reptiles, only bigger. They all want the same things: respect, understanding, and a good scratch in the right spot." Across the stars, Prince Vex'Allahur had implemented a new training program for young dragons, teaching them to recognize the value of what he now called the mammal perspective. In his royal chambers, displayed with surprising prominence, sat a framed photograph of a Nebraska teenager and an iguana named Ferdinand. The universe, it seemed, had been changed by a girl who wasn't afraid of big lizards and just wanted to give them a hug. The years that followed the Nakamura Accord, as it came to be known, transformed interstellar relations in ways no predictive algorithm could have forecasted. What began as a desperate last attempt to prevent human extinction blossomed into a renaissance of interspecies cooperation that rippled across the known universe. 6 months after the initial treaty, Prince Vex'Allahur made an unprecedented state visit to Earth, specifically to Nebraska, where the Nakamura Reptile Sanctuary had been expanded to include a draconic cultural center. The sight of the massive dragon royal, delicately examining incubating iguana eggs, while Cassidy explained optimal temperature gradients, was broadcast to trillions of beings across 17 galaxies. "Observe!" the prince rumbled to his entourage of younger dragons, his translator set to educational mode. "The human understands that what appears to be stillness in the developing offspring is actually intense cellular activity. This parallels our own sacred hatching rituals, though on a smaller scale." Cassidy, now 18 and somewhat more comfortable with her celebrity status, nodded. "Life finds similar patterns across the universe, Your Highness. The basics of care transcend species." The comment, simple as it was, sparked a philosophical movement among dragon scholars that would produce over 7,000 treatises on trans-species care ethics within the decade. Meanwhile, the diplomatic corps that had once dismissed Cassidy's approach scrambled to incorporate her methods. The Galactic Diplomatic Academy hastily established a new department, Intuitive Xenobiology, with Dr. Eliza Matsuo appointed as its first director. "We've been approaching interspecies relations all wrong," Matsuo explained at the department's inauguration. "We've prioritized protocol over connection, formality over understanding. The Nakamura method teaches us that the most effective diplomacy begins with recognizing the fundamental needs and communication styles of other beings." Not everyone embraced the new paradigm. Hardliners in both human and dragon societies viewed the growing alliance with suspicion. Conspiracy theories flourished in the darker corners of the quantum net, suggesting that Cassidy was either a genetic experiment designed specifically to manipulate draconic brain chemistry, or that she was secretly under dragon mind control. The truth, as usual, was far simpler but harder for cynics to accept. Genuine empathy, properly applied, was more powerful than any technology or manipulation technique. Tarlok Gex, who had witnessed the historic first contact, eventually left his security position to establish the interspecies security consultation firm. His new approach to protection protocols incorporated what he called the Nakamura principle, the understanding that perceived threats often stemmed from misinterpreted communication rather than actual malice. "Before you reach for a weapon," he would tell his trainees, "ask yourself if you're misreading the signals. What looks like aggression might be curiosity. What feels like a threat might be an attempt at connection." 14 months after the Accord, an incident at the Proxima Centauri outpost tested these new principles. A juvenile dragon, barely a century old, had accidentally incinerated a human agricultural dome during what was later determined to be the dragon equivalent of a sneeze. Pre-Nakamura protocols would have classified this as an act of aggression requiring military response. Instead, following the new guidelines, The station manager invited the mortified young dragon to participate in the rebuilding process. The resulting collaborative project yielded a hybrid structure, incorporating both human agricultural technology and draconic thermal management systems, creating a farm dome that produced 3 times the yield of standard models. Back on Earth, the Nakamura Sanctuary became a pilgrimage site for diplomats, xenobiologists, and cultural exchange students. Cassidy's parents, initially overwhelmed by their daughter's sudden fame, adapted with the practical resilience that had defined their family for generations. "We're still just reptile people," Hiro Nakamura would tell visitors as he guided them through expanded habitats, housing species from across the galaxy. "Only difference is, our definition of reptile got a whole lot bigger." Cassidy herself divided her time between the sanctuary and her new role as special consultant to the Interspecies Advisory Council. She refused all official titles and positions, insisting that her value lay in her outsider perspective. "The moment I become part of the system," she told a frustrated bureaucrat who tried to offer her a formal ambassadorship, "I'll start thinking like the system, and then I'll be useless." Instead, she maintained her hands-on approach, working directly with various species, developing personalized communication strategies, and occasionally mediating conflicts that had stumped conventional diplomats. Her methods remained deceptively simple: observe carefully, respect boundaries, find common ground, and always prioritize understanding over protocol. In one particularly tense standoff between Arcturian hive minds and Denabian crystalline entities, Cassidy spent 3 days simply watching their interaction patterns before identifying the issue. The Arcturians' collective thought processes generated electromagnetic frequencies that the Denabians interpreted as territorial challenges. A simple dampening field resolved a conflict that had persisted for 7 centuries. 2 years after the accord, Prince Vexelaher ascended to the Dragon High Council, bringing with him a revolutionary proposal: the establishment of a Galactic Empathy Institute, dedicated to researching and teaching cross-species understanding. To the shock of conservative dragon elders, he named Cassidy Nakamura as its honorary director. "The human child who was not afraid," he announced in his installation speech, his massive form resplendent in ceremonial armor that now included a small emblem of Earth, taught us that fear is often the only barrier between conflict and cooperation. We dragons have long prided ourselves on being feared. Perhaps it is time we prided ourselves on being understood instead. The speech reverberated across dragon society, sparking a cultural renaissance that would eventually be known as the Great Softening, a period when dragon art, literature, and philosophy began exploring concepts of gentleness and connection that had previously been dismissed as weaknesses. Not all the changes were philosophical. Practical applications of the Nakamura method resulted in technological innovations that benefited multiple species. Human engineers, drawing inspiration from Cassidy's reptile handling techniques, developed new approaches to dragon biotechnology that had previously been considered too dangerous to explore. The Thermal Exchange Initiative, spearheaded by a joint human-dragon research team, adapted the principle of sweet spot pressure points to create renewable energy systems that harvested the natural heat dragons produced. Within 5 years, these systems provided clean energy to 17 previously resource-poor colonies. Dragon medical researchers, meanwhile, adapted their advanced regenerative technologies to human physiology after realizing that the principles Cassidy used to treat injured reptiles could bridge the gap between their different biological systems. The resulting therapies revolutionized human medicine, extending average lifespans by decades. 3 years after the historic meeting on Draenus Prime, Cassidy faced her greatest challenge yet. A faction of isolationist dragons, opposed to the growing integration with lesser species, staged a dramatic protest by occupying the newly established Cultural Exchange Center on Rigel IV. Their leader, Lord Dracomir, demanded an end to the mammal-appeasing policies that he claimed weakened dragon supremacy. Against the advice of security experts, Cassidy requested a face-to-face meeting with the protesters. Footage of the 19-year-old human walking alone into a chamber filled with agitated dragons, each capable of reducing her to ash with a single breath, became one of the most watched recordings in galactic history. What happened inside was not initially broadcast. Only later, when tension had dissipated, was the recording released. It showed Cassidy sitting cross-legged on the floor, looking impossibly small among the towering dragons. "I'm not here to convince you that I'm right." Her voice was calm in the recording. "I'm here to understand why you believe I'm wrong." For 7 hours, she listened as the dragons expressed their fears. Fears that few had recognized beneath their formidable exteriors. They spoke of ancient traditions being lost, of younger dragons abandoning their heritage, of the discomfort of rapid change. Cassidy did not argue. She asked questions. She acknowledged concerns. When appropriate, she shared parallel examples from Earth's history, times when cultures had feared extinction through integration, only to find new strength in adaptation. By the end of the marathon session, no minds had been dramatically changed. But something more important had occurred. Communication had been established. Lord Dracomir agreed to form a cultural preservation committee that would work within the new interspecies framework, rather than against it. As Cassidy left the chamber, visibly exhausted, but unharmed, Lord Dracomir was recorded saying something that would later be inscribed on monuments across dragon territories. "The human does not try to make us less dragon. She helps us discover what being dragon truly means." The incident marked a turning point in the integration process. Opposition didn't disappear, but it found constructive channels rather than destructive outlets. Cassidy's willingness to listen to criticism rather than silence, it became another principle in what was now being formally taught as Nakamura diplomacy. 4 years after the Accord, the Intergalactic Council officially recognized the Nebraska approach as a foundational methodology for contact with newly discovered sentient species. The days of approaching unknown civilizations with warships and weaponry were replaced by trained contact specialists, many of whom had completed internships at the Nakamura Sanctuary, learning from the source. The approach proved spectacularly successful with the silicon-based intelligences of Tau Ceti, beings who had destroyed 3 previous contact missions but responded positively to specialists trained in Nakamura techniques. The resulting alliance brought unprecedented advances in computational technology to the galactic community. Throughout these years of transformation, Cassidy herself remained remarkably unchanged. She still wore plaid shirts, though not the original, which remained in the museum. She still worked hands-on with reptiles of all sizes. She still served milkshakes when she was home in Nebraska, much to the delight of tourists who traveled light years for the chance to be served by the Dragon Whisperer. Her 20th birthday was marked by celebrations across 17 galaxies. Dragon hatching grounds performed the sacred flame dance in her honor. The Arcturian hive minds composed a symphony of collective thought patterns dedicated to her work. On Earth, the President of the United World Government declared Empathy Day a global holiday. Cassidy celebrated by taking the day off to help a clutch of rare Betelgeusian spine lizards hatch in the sanctuary's incubation chamber. When a reporter managed to reach her there, asking how it felt to be the most influential human in galactic history, Cassidy looked up from the tiny iridescent hatchling in her hands and smiled. "I'm not special," she said, gently helping the newborn creature take its first drink of water. "I just happen to be the right person in the right place with the right experience. There are millions of people across the universe doing exactly what I do, seeing beyond appearances, finding connections, building trust. I just did it with someone big enough that people noticed." The reporter, expecting something more profound, looked disappointed. "But you changed everything. You prevented war. You transformed interspecies relations forever." Cassidy carefully placed the hatchling in its climate-controlled habitat before answering. Look, here's what I believe. The universe isn't naturally hostile. Conflict usually comes from misunderstanding, fear, or pain. If you address those root causes, if you show genuine curiosity about others and really listen to them, cooperation becomes the natural state. She gestured to the hatchling, now exploring its new environment with delicate steps. This little one doesn't know it's supposed to be afraid of me. It only knows whether I treat it with care or carelessness. That's true of most beings. No matter their size or power, we're all just trying to survive and, hopefully, thrive. When we recognize that shared goal, the differences become less important. As the reporter left, Cassidy turned back to the hatchlings, unaware that her simple philosophy would be quoted in educational materials across the galaxy for centuries to come. 5 years to the day after the historic first contact, Prince Vexilahar, now High Counselor Vexilahar, made a formal announcement that sent shockwaves through Dragon Society. He had adopted a human child, the 5-year-old boy, orphaned during a natural disaster on one of Earth's colonies, would be raised as his heir, according to both human and dragon traditions. The Nakamura Accord taught us that different species can find common ground, the massive dragon stated, his adopted son perched comfortably on his armored shoulder. This child will grow understanding both worlds, becoming a living bridge between our peoples. The unprecedented adoption required the creation of entirely new legal frameworks and cultural protocols. Teams of human and dragon childcare specialists collaborated to design living quarters that would be both safe for a human child and respectful of dragon traditions. Nutritionists developed dietary plans that allowed father and son to share meals, despite their radically different biological needs. Educational curricula were created that honored both heritage lines. The boy would learn dragon history and flame control techniques alongside human literature and mathematics. Special translation devices were developed that would allow him to both understand and eventually produce dragon vocalizations. Despite lacking the necessary biological structures, when asked for her opinion on this extraordinary development, Cassidy was characteristically straightforward. "Love finds a way," she said. "It always has. The details are just details." The adoption inspired similar cross-species family formations throughout the galaxy. While not all were as dramatic as a dragon raising a human, the principle, that family could transcend biological categories, took root in thousands of cultures. 6 years after the Accord, the Galactic Educational Consortium implemented a required course for all students, Understanding the Other. The curriculum, based on Cassidy's methods, taught practical skills for cross-species communication and conflict resolution. Within a generation, these techniques would become as fundamental as mathematics in educational systems across the known universe. 7 years in, the economic impact of the Nakamura paradigm, as economists now called it, had transformed galactic markets. Trade routes that had been considered too dangerous due to species conflicts became viable. Resources previously hoarded for military preparations were redirected to collaborative projects. The resulting prosperity lifted billions of beings out of poverty across multiple systems. The Intergalactic Banking Council, which had once calculated the cost-benefit ratio of human extinction, now published a retrospective analysis showing that the Nakamura approach had generated more wealth across species lines than any technological innovation in recorded history. It turns out, the council's chair being noted dryly, that not killing each other is extremely profitable. 8 years after the first contact, Cassidy Nakamura, now 25, finally accepted a formal position, Professor of Practical Xena Relations at the newly established Interspecies University on neutral territory at the Galactic Core. Her first lecture was attended by beings from over 300 different species, some traveling for years to hear her speak. The lecture hall had been specially designed to accommodate everything from microscopic silicon intelligences to massive methane-breathing entities. Translation systems ensured that every being received Cassidy's words in their native communication form, be it spoken language, telepathic impression, chemical signal, or gravitational pulse. Cassidy, still dressed in her characteristic plaid shirt and jeans, stood on the central platform and looked out at the extraordinary gathering. "I'm not a theorist," she began, her voice carrying to all corners of the vast space. "I don't have complicated models or elegant equations. What I have is experience, hands-on, sometimes messy experience with beings very different from myself." She activated a holographic display showing Ferdinand, the iguana from her childhood photograph. "Everything I know about interspecies relations began with this fellow right here. Ferdinand taught me the most important lesson. Just because someone doesn't communicate like you do, doesn't mean they have nothing to say." For the next 3 hours, Cassidy shared practical techniques, demonstrated communication approaches, and answered questions from beings so different from each other that a decade earlier, they would never have occupied the same space without violent conflict. At the conclusion of her lecture, she offered a simple summary that would eventually be inscribed on the university's central monument. "The universe speaks in 1,000,000 different languages. Our job isn't to make everyone speak ours. It's to learn enough of each other's to build something new together." 10 years after the historic Draenus Prime meeting, Cassidy returned to the orbital diplomatic station for an anniversary celebration. The station had been transformed from a tense military outpost to a thriving cultural hub, with sections adapted for comfortable habitation by dozens of different species. The original meeting chamber had been preserved as a historical site. Standing there again, Cassidy seemed momentarily overwhelmed by the decade of change her actions had initiated. Prince, now High Counselor, Vex'Allahur attended as well, accompanied by his human son, now a confident 10-year-old who moved with ease between human and dragon social circles. The boy wore a plaid shirt, similar to Cassidy's original, which had become something of a cultural symbol for interspecies bridge builders. "Did you know?" the dragon ruler asked Cassidy privately during the celebration. "Did you somehow calculate the effect your actions would have?" Cassidy laughed, the sound echoing in the chamber where, a decade earlier, her unusual approach had changed the course of galactic history. "Not at all. I was terrified, actually, but I figured if I was going to die anyway, I might as well die being true to what I knew. And what I knew was reptiles." She smiled at the massive being who had once been poised to incinerate her. Really big reptiles, as it turned out. Vex'Allahur made the rumbling sound that humans now recognized as draconic laughter. "The universe aligned perfectly, sending us a human who understood scaled beings just when we were ready to eliminate your entire species." Or, Cassidy suggested, maybe the universe always provides opportunities for connection, and we just need the courage to recognize them. The anniversary celebration concluded with the unveiling of a new initiative, the Multi-Species Exploration Corps, dedicated to discovering and contacting new civilizations throughout the unexplored regions of the galaxy. The Corps would operate according to Nakamura principles, approaching unknown beings with curiosity and respect rather than fear and weaponry. Cassidy was offered command of the flagship vessel but declined, suggesting instead that Vex'Allahur's son, a being of two worlds, would be the perfect captain when he came of age. Until then, she recommended a rotating command structure with representatives from multiple species sharing authority. "The future shouldn't be shaped by any single perspective," she explained. "Not even mine." As the celebration wound down, a young dragon, barely 50 years old, the equivalent of a teenager, approached Cassidy shyly. "Is it true," the young dragon asked, "that you weren't scared when you first met High Counselor Vex'Allahur?" Cassidy smiled. "Of course I was scared. He was the most dangerous being I'd ever encountered. Then why did you approach him? Why did you touch his scales? Because sometimes, Cassidy said, gently placing her hand on the young dragon's forearm scale, in the gesture that had become a universal symbol of cross-species respect. The only way past fear is through it. And on the other side, you often find connection you never imagined possible. The young dragon's scales flushed with the purple hue of deep emotion. I want to be like you when I mature. I want to build bridges between worlds. You don't have to wait until you mature, Cassidy told her. You can start today, with the being right in front of you. That's how it always begins, one connection at a time. As night fell on Draenus Prime, the diplomatic station orbited into the shadow of the massive dragon homeworld. In the observation dome, beings from dozens of species gathered to watch the spectacular lightning storms that perpetually circled the planet's equator. Cassidy stood among them, not as a diplomat or a celebrity or a professor, but simply as one being among many, sharing a moment of wonder at the beauty of a universe that was, perhaps, less hostile and more connected than anyone had previously imagined. Beside her, Prince Vex'Allaher's massive form cast a shadow across the observation deck. You know, the dragon ruler rumbled softly, in our ancient texts, there is a prophecy about a time when the barriers between species would fall, when ancient enemies would find common ground. And you think that's now? Cassidy asked. The enormous dragon gazed down at the human who had changed everything with a simple act of courage and understanding. I think it began the moment you said, "Don't be scared, big lizard. I just want to hug you." Cassidy laughed. Not my most diplomatic moment. On the contrary, Vex'Allaher replied, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the lightning storms below. It may have been the most diplomatic moment in galactic history. As they stood together watching the storm, representatives of species that had once been mortal enemies, now allies and friends. Cassidy reflected on how far they had come, and how much further they might yet go. The universe, vast and mysterious as it was, suddenly seemed less intimidating. After all, even its most fearsome inhabitants were, perhaps, just big lizards in need of understanding, and occasionally, a hug.